Most applications, regardless of the programming language that they are written in, are broken up into smaller blocks known as functions, and Python's no different. Functions give us a way of organizing our programs so that they are more understandable and modular. In this example, we're going to take a look at how functions work in Python. So in my editor, I'm going to open up the functions_start file, and we're going to start off by defining a function. So functions are defined with the def keyword along with a name, so I'll name my function func1, and then I'll use open and close parentheses. Now, this function doesn't take any arguments, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And next comes a colon character. The colon indicates that you're starting the scope or body of a function. And other languages like Java and C, for example, use curly braces for this, but Python uses the colon and then white space indentation. So I'm going to add a print statement here that says print I am a function. So you can see that the print statement is indented by 4 spaces. And it's up to you how many spaces you want to indent your code. It can be 4 or 3 or 2 or 8. It doesn't really matter. The important point is that it has to be indented to indicate that the statements belong to the function. All right, so down here at the bottom, let's add a few more lines of code. So we'll call the function by using its name and some parentheses. And then we'll print func1, again using parentheses. And then we'll print func1 just by itself with no parentheses. All right, so now let's go ahead and save and run. And let's watch what happens. Okay, so in the result, you can see that I am a function got printed, followed by the same string, says I am a function again, followed by the value of none. So what's happening is this. In the first case, the function is being called directly, which executes the contents of the function, causing the print statement to print the string, right? After all, that's what the function does. So that's simple enough. In the second case, the function is also being called inside the print statement, right? So the output is the same as the first case, okay? But then the outer print statement executes. And since our function doesn't return a result, Python evaluates the return value to be the constant of none and prints that. So these 2 lines right here are both the result of this statement right here. So when func1 gets called, it prints out this string, but then the print function prints out the return value of the function. And since there is no return value, the value is none, right? In the last case, the function itself is not actually being executed, since we're not including the parentheses. We're just printing the value of the function definition itself, which evaluates to this string right here. That represents the function object that we've defined. So this demonstrates that functions themselves are objects that can be passed around to other pieces of Python code. Now, we're not going to do that right now, but it's interesting to know that functions, just like any other object in Python, are values. You just pass these around. Okay, so let's go ahead and try a couple of different examples. So let's define a function that takes some arguments. So once again, I'll use the def keyword. I'll call this one func2, and inside the parentheses, I'll have arg1 and arg2. Once again, I'll have my colon, and inside the function, I'll simply print arg1, separated by a space, and then arg2. Right? And then I'm going to define a function that actually returns a value. So I'll define a function named cube, and that takes one argument named x. And I'm going to use the return keyword to return a value. And I'm going to return x times x times x. Okay, so now let's go back down to our code down here, and let's add a few more lines to evaluate these new functions. So I'll call func2 with the values of 10 and 20, and then I'll print func2, and once again, I'll call it with 10 and 20, and then, one more parenthesis there we go, and then I'll call print cube of 3. So first, I'm defining function 2, it takes 2 arguments, and all it's going to do is print out the 2 arguments with a space between them, and then I have my function called cube, which takes a number, and then returns that number multiplied by itself 3 times. So basically, it calculates the cube value of a number and returns it. All right, so let's go ahead and comment out these previous statements. And let's save, and let's run this. All right, and you can see that on the first line, we've got 10 separated by space, and then 20. And then on the second line, similar to the first example, we've got 10 space and then 20. But again, there's no return value, so it simply returns the value of none. And then for the cube function, we print the cube of 3 and get the value 27, because 3 times 3 is 9, 9 times 3 is 27. So in this case, the function does return a value, and that's what gets printed. All right, so far so good. Let's go ahead and add another example. I'm going to define a function that takes arguments and supplies a default value for one of the arguments. So I'll define a function called power, and that's going to take an argument called num, and another argument called x, and I'm going to write x equals 1. I'm supplying a default value in case it gets called without an argument for x. So inside, I'll have a local variable named result and set that to 1. And then I'm going to have a for loop. Now, again, we haven't covered loops yet, so just kind of bear with me for a second here. I'm going to have a loop that goes from I to the range specified by x, and I'm going to have result equals result times the number. And then once that loop is over, we'll return the result. So in a nutshell, I've defined a function called power, takes 2 arguments. One of them is called num, one's called x. It takes a number and raises it to the given power. Now you notice here that I've got x equals 1 in the function definition. This assigns a default value for that argument. Now again, don't worry about loops too much, but the idea here is that we're going to loop over the number of times that this value is passed to us and multiply the number by itself that many times. All right. So now let's add a couple of lines to execute this and try it out. So I'm going to print power of 2 just by itself, and then I'll print power of 2, and I'll pass in the value of 3 for the second argument, right? So in the first example, I'm calling the function power, but not giving it a value for x. So x is going to default to 1. And then the next call calls the function with num equals 2 and x equals to 3. So that's going to return 2 to the power of 3. Let's go ahead and comment out these previous ones, right? And let's run again. All right, and you can see that 2 raised to the first power is 2, and then 2 raised to the third power is 8. Okay, so let's add one more test. What I'm going to do now is write print power, and in this case, I'm going to reverse the arguments. I'm going to say x equals 3, and then num equals 2, right? So in this case, I'm reversing the order in which the arguments are called. So Python lets you call functions with their parameters being named along with the value. So when you do this, the Python interpreter figures out which arguments to supply the values to. So you don't have to call the function with the arguments in a particular order as long as you supply the names along with the values. So let's try this again. So you can see that in this example, we get 2 raised to the third power in both cases, so the answer is 8 in both cases. So we've got one more example to look at. I'm going to define a function that takes a variable number of arguments. So I'm going to define a function, and it's going to be called multi-add, and the arguments are going to start with a star, and then I'm going to call the arguments args. Then I'll have my colon, and I'll have a local variable named result. I'll initialize that to 0. Once again, I'll have a loop, so for x in the args, I'm going to write result equals result plus x. and then I'll return the result. So what I've done here is I've defined a function called multi-add, and the star character means I can pass in a variable number of arguments. So the function is going to loop over each one of the arguments and add them all to a running total, and then that's going to be returned as the result. So let's scroll down. Let's go ahead and comment these previous ones out, and then I'll print multi-add, and I'll pass in some numbers. Let's see, 4, 5, 10, how about 4 again? All right, so let's go ahead and save, and let's run this. And you can see that the result is 23. So I'll change the function call to include another parameter. Let's add another 10 on there. Let's save, and let's run again. Right, and now the result is 33. So you can combine a variable argument list with a set of formal arguments, but just keep in mind that the variable argument list always has to be the last parameter. So I could do something like this. I could say like, arg1, right? But that has to be first, okay? Oh, wait, actually, not there. Sorry, let's scroll back up. Here in the definition, I can have an argument that comes before the variable arguments, but all of my named parameters have to come before the variable argument list. This guy always has to be last, so that way the interpreter knows which of the parameters to assign to the variable list. All right, so it's a quick introduction to defining functions in Python.